2024 is drawing to a close, and I honestly cannot wait for this fucking miserable year to be over. Obviously, things don't just magically change just because one year is ending and another year is beginning, but 2024, for me at least, has just been tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. I'll start with what was easily the worst thing to happen to me this year, and it happened at the very beginning of the year, which I guess was an omen for how things were going to be this year. My cat Charlie died. For those of you who didn't see the community post I made the day he died, in tribute of him, he died on January 4th of this year. It happened seemingly out of nowhere. I mean, in his last few months he was slowing down and losing some weight, but I chalked that up to, well, he's 15 years old. But even still, the July before he died, we took him to the vet, and the vet was like, well, there's nothing wrong with your cat. Your cat is actually shockingly healthy for a cat as old as he is. It's natural for cats to slow down and even lose some weight in their old age, so we were like, okay, he's fine. They even ran some tests on him that all came out fine as well, and yet 6 months later he dies. In a pretty traumatic way, for me at least. He had about as peaceful of a death as you'd wish for your pet to have. On most nights, since I was a kid, Charlie would jump in my bed and sleep right next to me. It's a testament to how much of a connection we had, because he knew when I was about to go to sleep. You probably know by this point, but I have a very unorthodox sleeping schedule. I could go to sleep at like 6:30 in the morning, sometimes a little later than that, and wake up in the afternoon, and around 5 or 5:30 in the morning, Charlie would be at my door scratching to come in because he wanted to go to sleep next to me. And the first thing I would do when I would wake up with him beside me was pet him. And on January 4th, I woke up and proceeded to do just that and noticed that he was weirdly unresponsive. I didn't want to believe he was dead at first. I thought maybe he was just in a really deep sleep, which did happen sometimes. Charlie had a tendency to snore while he slept, and I wasn't hearing him snoring. I didn't hear him breathing, and I wasn't seeing the side of his body move up and down to indicate that he was breathing. And I made the fatal mistake of opening up his eyelids and seeing that his eyes were completely lifeless, and that image is going to be forever burnt in my mind. Since the 1 year anniversary of his death is somehow creeping around the corner, I do plan on making a tribute video for him and uploading that on the anniversary of his death, but we'll see if I actually do make that video though, because even just talking about him a little bit here was pretty painful for me. And I did initially want to make a video about him around the time he died, but that would have been way too painful for me. I mean, I did one when my cat Debbie died, but Debbie was more so my grandma's cat than she was my cat. Obviously, I was really sad when Debbie passed away, but losing Charlie was on a whole other level. I had to unplug from everything online for a few days after he died. The following month in February, I had a great aunt who passed away. She wasn't someone who I was terribly close to, and I wasn't related to her by blood. I didn't really consider her a great aunt, though, because she really wasn't that old. She was still in her 60s. She met my great uncle when she was young. Dare I say, almost disturbingly young, but I'm not gonna go there. She had 2 of my cousins with him, and their marriage didn't last, and she moved on to another guy. That marriage didn't last either. She ended up dying from a very, very rare illness that primarily affects women, and I'm sorry, I forget the name of it. The last time I saw her, before I visited her in the hospital right before she died, was about 5 years ago when she came to visit my house with one of my cousins. Her disease had already advanced by then, and no shit, even though she was in her early 60s at that point, she looked like a woman that was in her 90s. She even had an oxygen machine that she had to carry with her at all times, and when she was talking with my grandmother on the couch next to her, I was just fixated on the fact that she is nearly 20 years younger than my grandmother, yet looks to be about 10 years older. At the time, my grandmother was either 79 heading into 80 or was already 80. And when I visited her in the hospital right before she died, this was probably like a little less than a week before she passed away, she looked like a woman in her 90s that was on her deathbed. She was bone skinny, incredibly frail. And she was, I think, 67 when she passed away. And of course, 67 isn't incredibly young or anything, but there are still plenty of people that age that are still living life, and are still incredibly active. I have an uncle who was just a few years younger than her. He's still riding his bike all over the place, he's still very active. But she had to be dealt a shitty hand and have this horrible disease that cut presumably many years off her life. She did agree to have her body be used post-mortem for further research into this disease, and for doctors to potentially gain a better understanding of this disease, which I find to be commendable. If I ever end up getting an extremely rare disease that I know I'm going to die from, I would agree to the same thing. Unfortunately, she had to die from it, but hopefully any knowledge gained from her will be used to help anyone else who may contract this awful disease in the future. But she seemed to be in surprisingly high spirits in the days leading up to her death. She was still smiling and joking around, and she seemed to be at peace with being at the tail end of her life. But I guess when you're in that situation, there's nothing really much else you can do. If it's the end, and no amount of kicking and screaming will change that. I'm just glad she didn't spend her final days in agony and that her suffering is finally over. And now we move on to May, and I'm sure some of you already know who I'm going to talk about here, as there is some overlap between my audience and hers. An online friend I had named Nicole, or as she was best known on this website, Dark Scythe. Her passing is still something I struggle to deal with, as is the case with every other loss I have faced. But hers especially. With my cat Charlie, you can say he was 15. That's senior age in cat years. Or my grandmother, she was 81. But Nicole was only 24, and I'm not going to share the cause of death here. Her partner only wishes for that information to be known amongst those she was closest to online. All you need to know is that her death wasn't a suicide. Her life was just cut short one day. She had so much more life to live, and her death is something that will never be fair to me. She wasn't living in the best situation at the time of her death. She was a trans woman living in a deep red state that had very draconian anti-trans laws. But she was supposed to leave where she was relatively soon at the time of her death, but obviously that never ended up happening. But above all else, she was obviously more than just her hardships. She was a very kind, funny, interesting, and intelligent person. I was in quite a few Discord voice calls with her, and those were always a blast. A few years ago, she used to do those almost nightly in her server, and I would join a lot of those. She was also a very talented content creator, far more talented than I could ever dream of being. She managed to be entertaining and insightful at the same time, and I really enjoyed her political commentary videos and streams. Her claim to fame on this site was calling out and starting feuds with people in the commentary community, and honestly, I don't really know much about that. I mean, I am a commentator on this website by definition, but I never really interacted with the commentary community in general, or at least the sector of the commentary community she routinely went after during that time. I knew her way before all that. I met her on Miiverse in 2013. We both liked a certain YouTuber back then. We talked a little on there, and we talked on and off to each other throughout the years until 2020. That's when we started talking regularly. Aside from not being able to accept her death and obviously being sad over her death is also just, I guess for lack of a better word, bizarre to me. Not bizarre as in the way she died was bizarre, but rather, this is the first time a friend of mine has passed away, both in real life and online. I was close to losing a friend in 2018. He attempted to take his own life, but thankfully the attempt failed, and thankfully he is doing much better these days. The closest I've ever been to losing a friend before Nicole was also in 2018, when the girlfriend of someone who I was good friends with back then passed away. But I only had like a handful of interactions with her, and they were all friendly, and she was a very nice person, but I was never really too close to her. So Nicole was the first actual friend of mine to pass away, and again, her life was unfairly swiped from her at a young age. But overall, she is just someone I am glad to have had in my life. Anyway, the last major thing I will talk about in this video is something that happened in July, early July. One of the uncles I live with had a stroke, a pretty severe stroke, and he is incredibly lucky that it happened in a restaurant of all places that was only like 5 minutes away from a hospital. Because if this had happened in my basement, which is where he lived, he probably would have died. Ever since August, when he was admitted from the hospital, he's been in a rehabilitation center, and he's been learning how to walk again. He's been making some progress when it comes to that, but his right arm has been completely unusable since the stroke, and it is completely unknown if he'll ever regain function of it. And the frustrating thing is, he brought this upon himself. He had diabetes and wasn't taking his blood pressure medication. He instead turned to pseudoscience bullshit he found online. He was watching con artists like Dr. Oz pushing bullshit alternative medicine and insisting, no, you don't need to take your blood pressure medication. And now that fucker is going to have a position in Trump's administration. Words cannot describe how much hatred I have for that man. But even still, it's been really difficult. I have visited him a few times, and the first time I visited him, which was about a month after he had the stroke, he had just been admitted into the rehabilitation center. Me and my mom went into his room, and he saw me and he started crying, which was actually the first time I ever saw him cry. Prior to his stroke, he was a very stoic person. Even when my grandmother passed away, that's not to say he wasn't sad and was completely devoid of emotion when that happened, but he kept it together, at least when he was in front of people. But ever since the stroke, he's been crying pretty much every day, extremely depressed, which, I mean, anyone would be in that situation, and he had his problems even before the stroke, and the stroke exacerbated those problems. He had anxiety issues before the stroke, and those issues increased by tenfold, to the point of him calling 911 over the littlest things. It got to the point where we had to take his phone away and give him an iPad, and that's the most detail I'll give in this video. This is obviously a very personal matter that I wish to keep mostly within the family, and plus I don't think my family would really appreciate me gossiping about this to strangers online. Not like they watch my videos, but even still. All I'll say is it's been really difficult watching my uncle wither away on a bed and becoming increasingly erratic these last few months. It's taken a big mental toll on me and my mother and uncles as well. But that, coupled with everything else I've talked about in this video, and some other things in between, like my mother having to have her gallbladder removed, she's fine now, or my other uncle that I live with dislocating his shoulder last month, because part of the sidewalk my uncle was walking on was elevated and my uncle didn't see that, and that is totally on the city for being negligent, and you know, current events like the election and such, but I've already made plenty of videos about the election. You already know how I feel about that. All of that has just been weighing me down, and honestly I've been really depressed lately. I'd say this year, at least for me, is worse than 2020. Now, my grandmother passed away in 2020, and that event alone I still consider worse than everything that's happened to me this year. But honestly, before my grandmother's death, 2020 really wasn't all that terrible for me. I mean, obviously, current events that year were awful. We had COVID, mass protests, etc., but when it came to having to hunker down and stay home, I mean, it's not like I wasn't already used to that. I'm a person who doesn't socialize all that much, so I don't really go out unless I need to, like if I'm running errands, for example. So when we had to quarantine, it's not like that was a big lifestyle change for me. And online-wise, 2020 was pretty bad as well. I had multiple fallouts with a bunch of different people that year. The less I think about that, the better, though. But purely speaking about my personal life before my grandmother died, 2020 really wasn't all that bad for me. And even after my grandmother died, her death was what got me to get back in contact with my father, and I rebuilt a relationship with him and my father's side of the family. And I also have my paternal grandmother that I talk to frequently. She's the last grandparent I have now that's still alive. So even though my grandmother passing away was incredibly tragic, there was still light at the end of the tunnel. Something good still did come out of that. This year, though, it's just been misery throughout, and it's been really bogging me down, and that's why I'm making this video, to vent. Here's to a better 2025, hopefully, maybe, I kinda doubt it, but we'll see. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Bye-bye.